I don't understand how we can ultimately dismantle any of it if we don't stick to a intensely radical politics.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
This event is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Now more than ever, it is critical to support independent publishers, independent bookstores, and independent voices. There are two ways you can do this today. First, by buying books from Haymarket at haymarketbooks.org. And secondly, by joining the Haymarket Book Club. The following event will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. If you like this event, be sure to catch these upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. You can register for these upcoming events on the Haymarket Books Eventbrite page. If you miss an event, you can listen to the recording afterward by subscribing to our podcast, Haymarket Live, wherever you get your podcasts. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we cannot guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate these guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. This event will have live closed captions. Instructions for accessing the captions will be posted in the chat. We should have time for Q&A. So please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. Thanks for joining us today. Our event will begin shortly.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, After the Fall of Assad, the Struggle for a Free Syria. My name is Shireen, and I'll be moderator and discussant for today's webinar. This webinar is organized by Spectre Journal, a Marxist journal committed to internationalism, struggles against oppression, and to anti-racism, socialist feminism, and eco-socialism. The webinar is also endorsed by Counterpunch, New Politics, People Before Profit, Tempest Collective, Anti-Capitalist Resistance, Solidarité, the Fourth International, Promoting Enduring Peace, the Middle East Crisis Committee, and Abolition Ummah. Just 10 days ago, on December 8th, the Assad regime in Syria collapsed. After 53 years of Assad family rule in Syria and over 13 years since the start of the Syrian Revolution in 2011, the regime seemed entrenched and unmovable. But in just 2 weeks, rebels waged an offensive that captured one city in the country after another, with very little pushback on the ground. When Iran and Russia pulled out, Assad's fall became inevitable, and he fled to Moscow. Syrians within the country and in the diaspora have by and large celebrated the fall of the Assad regime, but there remain, of course, important questions about what's next for Syria. and questions in left movement spaces about how to understand the dynamics in Syria. So this webinar will attempt to answer this set of questions. So today's speakers are Leila Al-Shami, co-author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, and co-founder of From the Periphery Media Collective. Joseph Daher, Swiss-Syrian socialist and author of Syria After the Uprisings, The Political Economy of State Resilience, as well as Hezbollah, The Political Economy of Lebanon's Party of God, and most recently, Palestine and Marxism. Yasser Munif is an associate professor at Emerson College and author of The Syrian Revolution, Between the Politics of Life and the Geopolitics of Death. And as I said, my name is Shireen Akram-Boshar. I'm an editor at Spectre Journal and member of the Tempest Collective. So I'll be posing questions that we'll tackle for 45 or so minutes before turning it over to audience questions. So the first question, I'll address it to Yasser first. What are the circumstances that allowed for Assad's fall and with such rapidity, and why was Assad so unpopular even in regime-held areas? And was this a new development?
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you for inviting me. I think this is a really important event, and there is need for a leftist perspective on what's happening in Syria. The Syrian Revolution started in 2011, and by 2024, the Syrian army is exhausted and fragmented. It's been fighting for 13 years, and there is hunger, poverty, divisions, and fragmentation. But I think the bigger question for the Syrian regime and its collapse is that it ruled Syria through violence and terror. One of the pillars of the Syrian regime and the Syrian state is the prison system, which is apocalyptic. The level of violence and state terror within the prison system is just terrifying. And so most Syrians are not fans, are not supporters of the Syrian regime. By 2018-19, there's been a major economic crisis that can be traced back even further. But most of the population was near the poverty line or below the poverty line. The average salary of the soldiers, the military, were around less than $10. And so even when Assad promised to raise that salary by 50%, it wouldn't go much higher. In addition to that, when the opposition or the rebels attacked Aleppo is a really interesting city. It fell under the Syrian regime control in 2016. But since then, it's been controlled by a number of militias, local big families in Aleppo, in addition to the Iranian groups and Hezbollah-supported groups. And they've been occupying the houses, empty apartments, looting, terrifying the population, stopping people on checkpoints and terrifying them, kidnapping, torturing. And so they lost most of the people's support in that city. Very few people were really willing to support that regime or defend it when the opposition attacked. And so those were the condition of the city. In addition to that, there is the combination of what's happening in Gaza. Many of the Hezbollah troops were pulled out from Syria to fight in southern Lebanon. The Russians were occupied with the war in Ukraine, and a lot of their military power was diverted there. And so it was a propitious moment for the opposition to attack at that specific moment. And many of the generals and the military were also divided. There is a major division, for example, between Maher al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. One gets orders from the Iranian, while the other is closer to the Russian. And so the combination of all these divisions, an economic crisis, lack of support from the Russian and the Iranian and Hezbollah, led to the collapse of the city. And from there, the opposition was able to reach Damascus very quickly, within 10 days. So there are obviously other factors, but I think those are possibly the most important.
And any of the other speakers are welcome to jump in if there's something to add. But for now, I'll jump to the next question. So over the past few weeks, a debate has resurfaced on Syria, specifically within left movement circles. So while Syrians are celebrating the fall of the regime, a segment of leftists in the West are claiming that Assad's fall is nothing to be celebrated, that it's a gift to imperialism and to Israel, and that Syrians are basically celebrating jihadists taking over the country. And we'll have to break this down into these separate parts. But first of all, where is this narrative coming from? And is this a perspective that is common globally or in specific networks and movement spaces? And why does it seem like there are two almost entirely different perceptions when it comes to Syria specifically? And I'll put this to Leila first.
Thank you, Shireen, for inviting me and for organising this event. You know, people often say that Palestine exposed the hypocrisy of liberals and Syria exposed the hypocrisy of the left. And it's certainly the case that Syrians never received the solidarity they deserved from large sections of the left since 2011 and the popular uprising against the regime began. It's specifically this part of the left called the anti-imperialist left, or presents itself as the anti-imperialist left, which is still stuck in this very outdated Cold War worldview, where the world is divided into two camps or blocks. You have the imperialist bloc, which is represented by the US, by Israel, by the EU, and is always opposed. And then you have the anti-imperialist bloc, which is represented by China, Iran, Russia, and people say the Assad regime because of the Assad regime's rhetoric against the West and against Israel. So when the revolution broke out, large parts of this anti-imperialist left actually didn't stand with Syrians. They stood with the regime. They saw that the regime was worth defending as a bulwark against imperialism, and only ever bringing in a kind of geopolitical analysis to every struggle, rather than actually looking what are the conditions on the ground and what are people fighting for on the ground. So many people, they didn't come out overtly and said we stand with the regime, although some did. What they tended to do was try to discredit the opposition, promoting Assad's and Russia's narrative that all of the opposition to Assad are jihadists, using this war on terror language, spreading conspiracies to absolve the regime of blame and accountability, such as around chemical weapons massacres, saying that they either didn't occur or they were carried out actually by the rebels gas themselves. So this has gone on, you know, since 2011, and it's very prominent again today. Just today on social media, I saw a demonstration from somewhere in the US. It was a pro-Palestine demonstration, and people were holding regime flags. That was just today or yesterday. It's very hard to imagine that after you see the horrors of Sednaya, that people can actually come out and think that this regime is something worth defending, but that's the situation that we're in today. So, you know, there's this divide in the left, but the left should be supporting what's happening in Syria. You know, they've dismantled a totalitarian police state, and there's lots of positive things always to support. And certainly, I think the message from leftists, what leftists in the West can do, is really support calls for accountability for all those who have been involved in war crimes and human rights abuses, to call for foreign states to leave Syria. Everyone in the world has got involved in Syria, and it's now time for everyone to get out and to let Syrians determine their own future. Also the call to lift sanctions. You know, Syrians need to rebuild their country now. It's interesting, actually, because the only call that this part of the anti-imperialist left did support over the past decade and a half is trying to remove sanctions that were placed on the Assad regime. It will be interesting to see if they continue to support calls for sanctions. Now those calls are not protecting the regime, but are actually supporting the Syrian people to rebuild. Also calling on EU states to not pressure Syrian refugees to go home. We've seen in the past few days, many Syrians are returning back to their country. This is wonderful. They feel safe to do so. But there's also many reasons why people would not be able to return home right now. And it's imperative that any returns are people's choice to do so. It's free and it's voluntary returns. And then, of course, the left should be looking for who progressives are on the ground that they can support. They should be looking for other leftists, for feminists, for Democrats. I think we're going to see in the next period a huge revival of the civil movement in Syria. I'm very optimistic about that, and it's the duty of the left to support those forces and ensure that they grow in strength and can continue their struggle and actually become a powerful force for the future direction of the country.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And something I have mentioned many times is that whenever the military aspect of the revolution takes a step back, the civil and popular aspect moves forward, and we're seeing that now. And it's great to hear the role that leftists can play now too. But to break down that debate a little bit more and take a step back, let's talk a little bit about the Assad regime of both Bashar and his father Hafez al-Assad. So what was their relationship to the US, and how did they interact with Israel, and how did they develop Syria or interact with the Syrian people? I know that's a big question, but Joseph, if you could try to tackle it.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Spectre, for organizing this event. Very important, and it's a pleasure to be with friends and comrades speaking on their side. It's a real pleasure and an honor. If I may also add, and I totally agree with what Leila said, I think another division among the left is also the perspective of socialism from below and from above. I think this is also key to the division among the left. We've seen most of the people that are supportive of a form of socialism from above that do not have issues with authoritarian state, that claim to be, even with social social aspects, etc. No criticism, and we see that for the large section of the left, even with doubts, fears about the future, believing in the struggle from below, from socialism from below, have supported the Syrian uprising, and this is key. It's about believing once again that radical change from below is possible through, also mass movement from various, protest movement. And as you said, it's true. It was a military dynamic in the beginning, but at the end, the nature changed, and we've seen in the past few days massive demonstration throughout Syria, including all the ethnicities and sects of Syria. So I think this is also important. This not only as Leila has described, the only perspective is the geopolitical analysis, but also the inability to basically see the agency of the popular classes to decide their own future. Now, when it comes to your question, first of all, the nature of the Assad regime, and I think this also brings us to the geopolitical analysis and what kind of socialism we're talking about. Regardless of the foreign policies, Pierre Franck, a Marxist of the Fourth International, used to say, we never, analyze a state according to its foreign policies, but according to its policies towards its popular classes. And if we look, since the arrival of Hafez al-Assad to power in 1970, it is the willingness to build an authoritarian, despotic state, slow liberalization of the economy, opening to, bourgeoisie in Damascus and Aleppo. And it was a key year. It was a key year for the region because Hafez Assad came to power in 70, and it was the death of Abdel Nasser and the turn to infitah policy as well in Egypt. And that will bring Egypt to become 10 years later the second most important recipient of US financial military assistance in the world after Israel. And Hafez Assad, most important objective was to stabilize its state through a large coalition going from the bourgeoisie to sections of the petite bourgeoisie, liberalization. And this meant also, in addition to authoritarianism, we spoke about it, crushing the left firstly, and then afterwards the Muslim Brotherhood and all the kind of independent trade unions we had in Syria, professional associations, was all completely repressed. But moreover, it was about, having good relationship with what was called at the time the reactionary regimes of the Middle East and North Africa, Gulf monarchies, conservative regime, but also the US. And coming back to your question, actually, in the 70s, we see Kissinger, unfortunately very famous for its as a war criminal, many crimes, used to see Hafez Assad as an ally to fight against, progressive movement in the region and the Palestinian national movement. And this would materialize actually with the green light given by both the US and Israel for Assad regime intervention in Lebanon to crush, the coalition between the left, the Lebanese left, and the Palestinians. And this, we would see it again in the 80s, war of the camps against the Palestinians, thousands of political prisoners in Syria. But what's against in 91? The US war in Iraq, for the liberation of Kuwait, but we read for the discussion, for the beginning of the destruction of Iraq, Hafez Assad participated in it and was involved in this war in 91. Actually, a famous, and he passed away before seeing the liberation of Syria, Palestinian Syrian Marxist Salami Kaili was actually put in prison because he denounced in 91 the participation of the Syrian regime to this war. In the beginning of the 2000s, Assad was, really ready to be part of the war on terror, anti-terrorist campaigns, etc. And in 2008, Assad was welcomed by Nicolas Sarkozy, French president at the time, on the 14th of July. And the newspaper Le Monde, which is a quite well-known newspaper in France, had this title, a so well-behaved dictator. So Assad always played with US imperialism to be a factor of stability for US interest in the region and to prevent, progressive movement to emerge and any resistance movement. And this, from 74, there was a clear decision from the Assad regime to prevent any kind of military action or preparation from Syrian territories to liberate the Golan or for Palestinian solidarity action. So you could be put in prison in Syria if you prepared any kind of military resistance or actions against the occupied Golan. And this comes to the situation with Israel. A couple of times the Assad regime has tried to make peace with Israel at the end of the 90s. And there was a form of cold peace. So and coming back to the question you asked basically to Leila, so people saying it's a Western Israeli conspiracy, the offensive of the military offensive that started on 27th of November and led to the fall of the regime. The continuity is not here. The continuity is the day after the fall of the regime. The continuity with the Gaza war, the Gaza genocide, because they said there was a continuity with the Gaza genocide, the war in Lebanon, and after this military offensive. Because basically the military offensive started the day after the ceasefire in Lebanon. But the continuity is the day after the fall of the regime, because the Assad regime that had protected the borders with Israel for 40 years was not anymore here. So the day after this, they invaded the whole Golan of the territories and bombed the whole military infrastructures of Syria. Why? Because the main actor defending its borders was not anymore here, protecting it. And in a future, potential Syrian government, this military infrastructure could be used potentially. And it was also a message sent to the future people in power in Damascus, whoever it is. Any hostile attitude towards Israel will be punished. And moreover, it's again a message of Israel opposing any form of democratization, because they rather deal with dictators than, a democratization process. And I think here we understand the relationship between, Syrian regime, Israel, the US, with contradictions, but generally speaking, neither the US, neither the Israel wanted the fall of the regime. They wanted a weak Assad regime, but not its fall.
Right, and I believe the U.S. said a day or two ago that even after the fall of Aleppo, Israel still was not wanting the Assad regime to fall. So that was very helpful. Let's go back to 2011, because we can't talk about today without talking about 2011. So as the revolutions known as the Arab Spring emerged in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, it also erupted in Syria. What was distinct about Syria's revolution? There are a lot of misconceptions about this, but Leila, what would you say was distinct about Syria's 2011 revolution, or that began in 2011?
So I think what happened in Syria was the most thoroughgoing revolution of all the Arab Spring countries. The revolution quickly militarized. People took up arms to defend their communities from assault. And the armed struggle brought a lot of problems and a lot of negative aspects to the revolutionary process, the increase of warlords, authoritarian militias, etc. But it also provided opportunities, and that opportunity was the liberation of territory from the state. By 2013, you have something like 4/5 of the country were no longer under regime control. So as the regime was forced out of communities, people had to come together to see how they were going to self-organize to keep their communities functioning. And we saw these remarkable experiments in grassroots democracy that were springing up all around the country. We saw the establishment of local councils. These were like governance bodies where people were self-organizing to ensure that service provision continued, whether that's electricity, water supply, food, education, healthcare. People were organizing that themselves. And these local councils, in many cases, were chosen by democratic elections. These were the first democratic elections in over 4 decades that Syrians had. We often hear people say, oh, Syrians or the Arabs, they're not ready for democracy. But actually, when left to their own devices, people were democratically organizing. And we also saw like a flourishing of all different civil initiatives. We saw independent newspapers being set up around the country. This was in a state which prior to March 2011 had something like 3 state-controlled newspapers. There was no room for debate or political participation or discussion. We saw women's centres set up around the country, trying to encourage women to participate in the revolution, to be active politically, economically, challenge patriarchal structures in Syria. So these were amazing things, this amazing grassroots experience that there's so much to learn from. And it's a shame that a lot of that story just either isn't known or is ignored in favour of much more dramatic stories about jihadists or refugee crisis, etc.
Yasser, I know your book was a lot on what you called the micropolitics of the Syrian Revolution. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this question too?
Yeah, sure. To add to what Leila described, I think that one of the problems with the Syrian Revolution is, as Joseph and Leila mentioned, is that oftentimes it's reduced to its geopolitical dimension. And geopolitics, by definition, has a tendency to erase grassroots voices and people from working from below. Geopolitics, by definition, is interested in state and state interest and how to further those interests. And it invisibilizes people working on the ground, struggling, trying to reinvent institutions and social relations and so on. And so there was a unique opportunity in Syria because some territories were liberated, unlike Egypt or Tunisia, where for the most part there was revolt, there was occupation of squares, but the state took over and there were different government and elections and what have you. In Syria, there was a unique opportunity where the state was far away and there were territories liberated by the opposition, and an opportunity to reinvent autonomous institution far away from state violence and prisons and all that. And I witnessed that firsthand in Manbij in northern Syria, where people were exploring the history of Syria for the first time because that was not allowed during the Assad regime. The history books were either banned or unavailable. The educational system did not really teach history before Assad. Everything started really with Assad. And so people were rediscovering their history and rediscovering democracy and thinking about ways to make a life livable in places where their cities were bombed and the electricity was oftentimes cut and the thugs were sent to terrorize the population and so on. And so I think that allowed the population in Syria to gain real skills about how to do politics far away from the state. And that, I think, will help in the future period. People learned, as Leila described it, there were so many newspapers. There were open debates about different forms of state, different forms of political systems, political parties, what is the left, what is the right, what is secularism, and so on. I heard many of those debates, and people were invested and reinventing politics really for the first time. The prison system in Manbij and many other cities were open and they turned into museums, and people were terrified and wanted to reject that institution forever in Syria. And so I think there is a lot of potential in Syria, and people have learned a lot in the past 14 years or 13 years. There was a lot of violence, and oftentimes people reduce what happened in Syria to the military dimension, but there is way more than that. And I think we're going to see the implication of all that in the coming weeks and months in Syria.
Yeah, you're both reminding me. For a couple of years, I was translating newspapers from youth in Manbij, specific newspapers that they had started. And previously, before the revolution, there had only been state-run newspapers. So they were experimenting with things like, and they were like thinking about how do we solve the issue of bread lines and how do we, take ownership of aspects of our city that we weren't able to before. But I think another aspect of what made the Syrian Revolution unique was the level of violence of the regime, which also transformed the trajectory of the revolution, unfortunately, into a deep counter-revolution, which can help explain things like the rise of HTS, which I'll ask about now. So yeah, let's talk about HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. How did they develop in Syria throughout the course of the revolution? What role have they played, and what are they trying to play in? What role are they trying to play in Syria now? Joseph, if you'll take that one.
Thank you, Shireen. Yes, and in many ways, in the case of Syria, but wider in the region, there were multiple counter-revolutions. Obviously, the most violent ones were from the regime, and focusing on the repression on democratic, progressive actors. And we'll come back to this now. But while one of the chances of the first years of the civil protest movement is that it has been transmitted or orally archived these kind of popular experience have been transmitted to the new generation, because for a large majority of them, the people that participate in the first 2-3 years, they are not anymore in Syria, for a large majority, unfortunately, or they disappeared or have been eliminated, assassinated by the regime. But this experience has been transmitted, which is mainly different than in the 70s, beginning of the 80s, with the strikes, the experiences of the left, the trade unions, that only for small circles of people that most often had a leftist background in Syria were aware of. So this is a big chance. So now it brings me to an HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is a consequence of the first counter-revolution. And it rose like also as a counter-revolution itself by, emerging first as beginning of 2012, end of 2011, by Jabhat al-Nusra, which was a part of Islamic State first of Iraq, and then joined Al-Qaeda in 2013, basically, and broke with Al-Qaeda in 2016. And the evolution of HTS, and this is quite important as well, is that we have to understand, jihadist actors as political actors with strategies and with debates among each others, to treat them as rational actor. Saying this is not to say that they don't have fundamentalist orientation, but the worst thing we could do is not to analyze them similarly to other political parties, or to understand and how to combat them at the end, because this is also our objective, but not to exceptionalize them. And basically, HTS is a result also of the material conditions that we're living in. From 2015, HTS, which was after, it was first Jabhat al-Nusra after Fatah Sham, and took over Idlib in the northwest. And since then, has an evolution. It left Al-Qaeda, and you have other examples of, transnational jihadist organization focusing afterwards on their national framework. Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, or you had the case in Libya. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is now fighting, I would characterize it as a Salafist jihadist organization, focused in the Syrian national framework. Okay, and from there on, they also started to manage the population under which, they had to manage a population in the areas they controlled. They established the Salvation Government in 2017, which now today, for the new government in Damascus, is part of is the Salvation Government of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And also they adapted themselves. They were very pragmatist, and it was very clear from early on after this period that Julani wanted to play a role, so the head of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham wanted to play a role on a national scene. And this is how we see that he was very pragmatic. And in his first interview with an American journalist in 2021, he said, I can be a partner in the fight against terrorism. I fight against Huras al-Din, Al-Qaeda branch. I fight against Daesh. I'm not a threat to the West. My battle is in Syria. Afterwards, he allowed for the return of small population of Christian and Jews to show that he was, kind of more moderate. And at the same time, he was repressing, Al-Qaeda branch and Daesh kind of actors. And this continued during the military offensive. If you noticed, the statements he made regarding religious minorities, the only one that wasn't really that positive was regarding the Alawite, because they were, described as a tool of oppression and no clear future. But when you look at the Christians, Ismailis, Kurds, and after taking over Aleppo, Julani promised, a civilian government will come and manage Aleppo. We will withdraw. Damascus the same. And actually, the first objective and the main objective of these past few years of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is to be recognized as a rational actor with which regional and international states can deal with. And it's, to some extent, working quite fast. If you see already a lot of embassies are still opening, or channels are open. So when I say all this, does that mean that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a nice organization? No, very far from it. It's an authoritarian organization that have been facing continuous protest in Idlib against its rule. Few months before the military offensive, it faced the biggest challenge to its rule, massive demonstrations. We were talking about the prisons being liberated, but we're still awaiting the prison of Idlib to be liberated. There was demonstration of the family of prisoners a few days ago. It's an authoritarian organization. They have repressed democratic activists, opponents to them. It ruled in a very kind of also neoliberal way with crony capitalism, with affiliates of Julani benefiting from the private sector, while a lot of people have said the management of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib is very good. Well, most of the services is not provided by the Salvation Government, but by NGOs and INGOs. And also, it's important to say, people said, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is allowing Christians to play. We tolerate Islamic minority. Well, it's not about being tolerated. It's about being able to play a role in the future of the country, equality, etc. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is planning to consolidate its power. It has appointed its own government with the brother of Julani as a minister of health, neoliberal policies, no change. And one of its officers have made very reactionary statements when it comes to women's role in society. So it's an authoritarian Islamic fundamentalist organization and not at all ready for a democratization. They're planning to consolidate its power. There's no clear plan until now. What's the future? Election, constitutional committee? No, it's focusing on trying to reach power. But, and I'll stop here, the opportunity is the space that has been opened. There are contradictions, there are challenges, but also HTS has stressed a lot of its power. It cannot rule on its own. So this is the ability, the space maybe for progressive and Democrats to organize. So I think we shouldn't, to romanticize HTS at all, but to understand this organization, where it is originating, how it has evolved, and what's its objective. Its objective is definitely running against a democratic, social justice, and equal Syria.
Right. So over the past few weeks, there's been kind of a dual dynamic emerging. So on the one hand, HTS took over in a rapid military takeover, but on the other hand, as you mentioned, there's been an opening. Popular protests have returned with progressive messaging and some of the slogans from early in the revolution. So how would you characterize this kind of dual dynamic? If there's anything you'd like to add about that.
Sorry. No, I think, and this is where, again, I think there's a major difference between what we describe different sections of the left. I believe, in socialism from below, and any, space that opens for the popular classes to organize should be our key objective. More you open the space to organize, the better for us, for our interests. This door was completely closed 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. This door is now open. It does not mean that we romanticize the situation. There's huge challenges, difficulties. And as we were saying, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, its policies has not been to increase democratic space in Idlib, quite the opposite, to repress. Similarly to Syrian National Army, which is a Turkish proxy. And I think this is the second challenge we have to deal with. The first is rebuilding struggles from below, rebuilding trade unions, feminist organization, local associations. How do they structure each other on a national, regional level? Challenge, different things. But the second challenge, and I think this is really important for us, is to challenge the divide between Arabic Kurds. Not enough voices among the Syrian opposition is denouncing the plans of Turkey and of the Syrian National Army that already, committed lots of crimes in Afrin in 2018, which led to an ethnic cleansing. When I say this challenge and the isolation, if you want, of the Kurdish issue is, first of all, the responsibility for me of the majority of the Syrian Arab chauvinistic opposition. And historically speaking, when I say this, doesn't mean also that we have to romanticize the autonomous administration in the northeast. There are problems, there are contradictions. The latest event, for example, in the city of Raqqa, where demonstrations were shot at, injured, is unacceptable and must be condemned. But I mean, the first responsibility to see a future democratic, diverse Syria is today to condemn, as stated by the Turkish Foreign Ministry, the autonomous administration and the Kurds are a strategic threat to Turkey, basically, the autonomous administration. And this should be opposed. And again, here we need to rebuild, this the spirit that was present in 2011, but be clear on the issue of support of the Kurdish self-determination, support for it, which does not mean separation. Even though they wanted, I would support, but it's not their project. So I think these are the two key challenges: to rebuild from below, struggle from below. No trust should be given, whether to HTS, whether to SNA. And there are already civil initiatives, a lot of them. In Tartus, Damascus, people are trying to organize to build civilian committees on how to deal with the future. There are already many protests. For example, following the statements made by the official of HTS regarding women, there were protests today in Homs to denounce, these very reactionary statements, that they're not waiting for this personality for women what to do, and other forms of protests from below. But again, it needs time, it needs to rebuild, but at least, and yes, there's fear, but fear has been present for the past 50 years. Now the main difference, there's hope, and there's the space with its challenges and contradiction.
Absolutely. So when you're talking about challenges, and we've talked I'm thinking of imperialism, and we've talked a little bit about imperialism. So, for example, the two forces that were propping up Assad, Iran and Russia, but now there's the challenges of other imperialist forces trying to take advantage of the moment, being Turkey and Israel. So maybe we can start by talking about Israel, because since Assad's fall, obviously, Israel has been bombing and encroaching upon Syrian land. Joseph, you talked about this briefly, but what does this mean for the coming period in Syria? What are the options? Like, what can Syrians do about it? I don't know if, Yasser, you want to take that question up.
Yeah, just to add a few things about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I think that, as Joseph mentioned, Jolani is very pragmatic, very flexible, and that makes him a formidable political actor. And we have to be vigilant and always alert. For example, he outsourced the education in Idlib. Unlike other jihadist forces who took over the curriculum and imposed a very strict Sharia law and what have you, in his case, in Idlib, he allowed for the UNICEF program and a combination of the UNICEF program and the government program, while at the same time removing everything that is related to the Ba'ath. Same thing with the health sector. He allowed the doctor to operate the hospital. And the same thing with the humanitarian aid, to allow it to come in and allow the funding of that aid, in addition to the funding of education and what have you. And there is, I think, a very important and a rich debate within Jabhat Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They're not all on agreement. For example, some of them were for occupying additional territory and going forward with a frontal attack against the regime back in 2017, 18, 19, while Jolani was for the consolidation of power within Idlib and the implementation of civil administration to get the support of the population and so on. And I think those debates are still going to happen with the new government in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And so we can, I think, push in one direction or another. But Jolani is a formidable political actor, and I think he will try to consolidate power. He was able to take advantage of the struggle of 13 years. He did not achieve the liberation of Damascus or any of those cities. This is the culmination of many waves of struggles since 2011. But he was the last, and so he's taking all the credit. But we have to remember the struggles of millions of Syrians, many of whom are abroad now or were killed, tortured in the prisons, and so on. To the question of Israel, I think it's important to address this question because there is a lot of illusions about the Syrian regime's relationship to Israel. And I want to start with a very interesting moment, 1967, when Hafez Assad was the Minister of Defense, and he gave the order to the army to evacuate Jolan. When and there was confusion among the army because they haven't fought any yet, and they were asked to pull out of Jolan. And so there was a lot of confusion. Some of them did, some of them tried to fight. When the Israeli came, they found the city, they came 5 or 6 hours later, they found the city completely empty, and they were also destabilized. What's happening? Why is this happening? And what he did was pull the army and bring it back to Damascus to defend his regime. He was terrified that the Israeli might attack Damascus and he might his regime might fall. So this is Assad. He lost El Jolan and never really fought for it. In 1973, there was an attempt to fight and get it back, but it wasn't really serious. And fast forward, as Joe described, the relationship between the Syrian regime and different Palestinian factions, including Yasser Arafat and many others, he tried to either marginalize them, subjugate them, or take over. And whenever they disagreed with him, he completely isolated them, put them in prison, or expelled them from Syria. In 1976, he went into Lebanon to crush the progressive forces, the left and the Palestinian. And he also massacred people in the Palestinian camp in Lebanon, as well as in Syria, in Al-Yarmouk. If you look at the footage, and people are only now discovering the level of destruction and the ruins in Yarmouk is monumental. I mean, if you look at it, it's very similar to what's happening in Gaza. This is the level of violence that the Palestinians experienced in Syria. One of the most notorious prison branches in Syria is called the Palestine branch. It's massive. Thousands of Palestinians have been tortured there. Many of them killed. Anyone who opposed Assad's regime, politics, or policies on Palestine, Israel, oftentimes ends up there. A lot of it is underground, solitary confinement, the filth of this prison. There were footage recently from that prison is just apocalyptic, the kind of images that we saw. And since 1973, the Assad regime was protecting really the border between Syria and Israel, prevented any form of resistance. And there were several attempts at the emergence of popular resistance against Israel. People tried to form some kind of, individual small cells of people trying to resist Israel, and he crushed that. He made sure that border was silent, pacified, and there was no attacks on Israel from Syria. To this day, up until the fall of the regime, the Israeli army was attacking certain sites in Syria, for the most part, targeting the Iranian militias and Hezbollah military forces, and very seldom any Syrian forces or the Syrian army. With the fall of the regime, there was an unprecedented attack against the Syrian army. It was completely destroyed. Most of the tanks and fighter jets were destroyed. Ballistic missiles, most of the radars were destroyed. There is really nothing left of the Syrian army. It will take many years for the government to rebuild an army. And that tells us it sends a very clear message that the Israelis were not afraid of Assad. On the contrary, they were very happy with him. and they destroyed the Syrian army only after his departure, only after the fall of the Syrian regime. And so all those so-called anti-imperialists who are still defending the Syrian regime after its fall, after we discovered the horrifying images of the prisons and the killing in mass of thousands of people, they have to rethink their position in light of what happened in the past 10 days. Why is it that the Israeli are attacking the Syrian army in this way? Why was the Syrian army completely destroyed when it was almost left intact for the past 13 years? I mean, if the Israeli had done a fraction of that several years ago, Assad regime would have fallen, and the opposition would have taken over. But they chose to protect the regime because there was an unspoken agreement between the two that there is a benefit for both sides. The Syrian regime has built its legitimacy on this idea that it's fighting Israel, and there is, in fact, some form of help that the Syrian regime provided to Hezbollah and Iran by letting some weapons to be shipped to Hezbollah via Syria. But that was really just minimal, just to keep a face of being, I'm part of the axis of resistance. But the Syrian regime has never been serious about building any form of resistance or taking back Al-Jolan. And I think the message in the past 2 weeks is very clear.
Absolutely. So we're getting a lot of audience questions, which is amazing. So I'm just going to pose one more question to Leila, and then we'll shift to audience questions. Again, a kind of big question. What would you say are the prospects for Syria's future as a Syrian? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or a bit of both?
Well, if we're looking at Syria in terms of Syrians, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think, Syrians have been through so much over the past 5 decades. Any form of political organization was very much destroyed. So there's massive challenges ahead, and Joseph and Yasser have pointed to some of the challenges internally. But I am hopeful that if there's enough space for people to organize, that people will go back and start organizing. And this will be the next step of another challenge to go forward to see the kind of Syria that we'd like to see. I mean, Yasser spoke very powerfully about, Syrians have so much revolutionary experience. And this is not a population that thinks the same as it did before 2011. They've had so much experience and ways of organizing which they will bring back. Also, many people have been in exile. Syrians have also come into contact with different political cultures. They've been organizing in exile. This will really radically change Syria's future. So for that, I'm optimistic as long as there's enough space for people to start organizing and building up a credible and organized opposition or civil society to take things forward. My main concerns, as we've also touched on, is external interference. To what extent Syrians will be allowed to build the democratic country that they all want to see. We have a genocidal neighbor, Israel, on our doorstep, bombing us, not only bombing military targets, but it also hit the Hijra wa Jawazat in Damascus, the immigration and passport office. What's the strategic value to that? I mean, one can only assume that there's documents that Israel doesn't want to fall into our hands, probably from collaboration with the regime over the years. We don't know. And then, as has already been said, the worry about Turkey. Turkey was pursuing normalization with the regime. I don't think it expected that this would happen, but it's going to seize on this opportunity to position itself, and it's well placed to do so. And Turkey's agenda, as Joseph said, was preventing the establishment of Kurdish autonomy in the north, and also creating safe zones it wanted to do to send Syrian refugees back to Syria because of the rise in xenophobic nationalism in Turkey. So there's a real worry with Turkey's involvement that this is going to create ethnic conflict and division between Arabs and Kurds in the north of Syria, and that would be disastrous.
So before we go to audience questions, I'm going to read a message from Spectre editors. On behalf of all the editors at Spectre, I want to thank you for joining this event on Syria today. We are proud of the 5 years that we've dedicated to developing a critical Marxist journal committed to internationalism, anti-racism, socialist feminism, queer and trans liberation, rank and file labor activism, and eco-socialism. We're especially gratified by the enthusiastic response to our last 2 issues on Palestine and global liberation. But like many projects on the radical left, Spectre is financially precarious. For this reason, we've just launched a sustained subscription drive, and we need your support. If you're not yet a subscriber, please make that commitment today. If you do so now, you'll be able to subscribe for a special rate, which will not be available much longer. In the new year, we will be raising all our subscription rates. You will find a subscription link right now in the chat. And if you're already a subscriber, please help us recruit more. Let others know that now is the time to support the Spectre project. Spectre hopes to continue to building a left dedicated to global emancipation. To do that, we ask you to support our subscription drive however you can. Okay, so there are a lot of audience questions that I've been sent. So there are a lot of questions about relationship with Hamas. So for example, could the speakers discuss the tensions between Hamas and the Assad regime and how it impacted the relations with Iran? And then another one is, could you explain the relationship between HTS and Hamas? Is it the same ideology? So I figured we would start with those 2. If anyone wants to jump in. Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
Okay. On the first issue, Hamas relation with Syria and Iran, it's important to remember that prior to 2011, Hamas had established from the beginning of the 2000s its main headquarters in Damascus. Khalid Mishal was often perceived as one of the most important personality in Syria. Khalid Mishal was the head of the Hamas political bureau in exile or in the diaspora. In Damascus, they were allowed quite a lot of freedom to act, to operate, to launch, for example, to gather money, to collect money, also to to organize event, which was not given to all Palestinian political organizations. So they had quite of an ability to act and to operate. And the Syrian regime provided the space. After 2011, basically the relation stopped because Hamas refused to support officially the repression of the Syrian regime against the Palestinian population. So they left the country, first of all, to Egypt with the situation. Different leaders were in different countries, and afterwards to Qatar. And at this period, at the end of 2012, as Hamas refused to officially support the repression, Iran cut massively its funding to Hamas and provided more funding to other Palestinian organizations such as Islamic Jihad and others. They were still open lines of communication, especially for Hezbollah. Hamas maintained, for example, during this period, its main offices in Beirut, southern suburbs, in Dahiyeh. But the relation was very cold. In 2016, as the Syrian trajectory with militarization, rise of Daesh, and also the failure of the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Tunis, the kind of military, the military section of Hamas, who wasn't happy from the initial point of the breaking of relation with Iran, because Iran was basically the main actor providing them with weapons, pushed more and more to re-establish connections with it, and collectively, yes, as the uprisings turned in the way that wasn't beneficial for them, they started a rapprochement with Iran from 2016, and especially following the election of a new political bureau and the nomination of Haniyeh as head of the political bureau. Ghanem Meshal was still very much very badly seen until now by Iran, and also the role of Sinwar. Sinwar played a very important role to make a rapprochement with Iran. And this is where you had a new kind of relationship, much more strengthened, funding coming back. But that does not mean that Hamas is or has been or will be a proxy of Iran. Never has been. It is an independent autonomous actor that want to have multiple relationships. So even though Hamas had, re-established relations with the Syrian regime prior the fall, but it was very cold relationship for Hezbollah mainly. Actually, the first statement they made was to celebrate the victory of the Syrian population, just as Islamic Jihad as well. So Hamas, I think, will continue, but also there's internal, differences. There's internal dynamics within Hamas to understand that, as other Palestinian political party, you have Hamas from the inside, you have the Gaza Strip, you have the West Bank, and you have from the diaspora. And now, definitely, the Hamas of the Gaza Strip that was dominating the party since the beginning of 2010 has been very much weakened. And I think we'll need even another webinar, but I think the fall of the Syrian regime is underestimated by a lot of people by its regional and international repercussions regarding the role of Iran, regarding what is going to happen to Palestine, the role of, I think it's very much underestimated. So this is how we understand basically the relationship. But Hamas' main objective is to open various, communication lines with different regimes, not only to be in a tango with one particular axis. So always maintain with Turkey, with Iran, to play. But we come back to the main issue, and we spoke about it, that it counts on foreign states to advance the Palestinian cause, whereas all of them advance, first of all, the geopolitical interests. Iran's main interest since the 7th of October, even prior to this, is to instrumentalize the Palestinian issue to advance its own interest in future negotiation with the US, not to liberate Palestine. So I think this is how we understand this relationship between these actors. And I think, Iran is also being very now pragmatic to its future relation with Syria. 2 weeks ago, it was struggling against the Takfiri-supported Zionist groups. Now it's saying, basically we support the decision of the same population for the future. So again, we can see, the pragmatism, but it's definitely a big blow for Iran and Hezbollah, what happened.
Yeah, a lot of the questions are related to Palestine, but I wanted to jump to one that I think is important. Could the speakers discuss who the progressives on the ground are, given that many revolutionaries were killed, disappeared, or forced into exile? Yasser, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. To just add a few words about the new relationship between the HTS and Hamas and their view of Israel. So just recently, just a few days ago, Jolani said that Syria won't be used to attack Israel. And I think, as we said, Jolani is pragmatic. His main focus right now is to get international approval and support, humanitarian aid flowing, and funds for reconstruction. And with the destruction of the Syrian army, complete destruction of the Syrian army, I think it's also unrealistic to and undoable to launch any kind of military action against Israel. But I think Jolani and HES could go either way. We know from the past that Islamist movement don't have to be necessarily against Israel. The Syrian population, I think, for the most part, has a tendency to support the Palestinian cause and resist Israel. As long as there is occupation, there will be resistance. Sooner or later, that resistance will take shape and will emerge. We don't know yet how and where and when, but I think it will emerge. And the other thing I would say is that the mostly Druze population in Jolan is opposed to Israel and is still consider themselves Syrian. So despite the annexation of the Golan and despite the Trump recognition of the Golan in 2019, this still is a major question for any Syrian government in the coming years. What kind of relationship do they want to have with Israel? And how is that going to shape their relationship with the West in general, the US, and the question of funding and relationship with international institutions and so on? I think there will be a lot of pressure from below. People will not accept just surrender to Israel. That seems to be the position of HCS so far, because they are in a very weakened position. They just toppled the regime and they don't have any capabilities. I'm sure that there is an internal discussion within HCS and beyond, within different factions. The left in Syria has traditionally been, and beyond the left, the Arab nationalist movements and parties have always been putting Palestine at the center of their struggle and political ideology. So I think it's almost impossible to escape that question, and it will be at the center of any political debate in the coming few months as there is a stable government. Now on the question, could you remind me of the question again?
Yeah, the person asked, who are the progressive forces on the ground? Obviously, we've seen, as I mentioned, or as you all have mentioned too, that we've seen a resurgence of protest movement. Who are the progressive forces we should be looking to?
So in terms of political parties, those were crushed by the Syrian regime a long time ago. They were operating as political party, but also very active in unions and so on. And all these structures were decimated by the Syrian regime. Many people were put in prison, tortured, killed, or exiled. There are a lot of grassroots groups and committees that have emerged. Many of them are progressive, secular. Generally speaking, I would describe them as progressive. I think the two major forces that are on the ground right now, and we saw operating in the past several years, are the Kurdish forces that have very progressive ideology, despite the tensions and some of the limitations, but they call for gender equality and for social justice and some form of autonomy and democracy and so on. And there are also a lot of interesting and powerful popular forces in the Sweda region and Daraa region. And we saw the massive protest against the regime, despite the threat of violence and actual violence against many of the activists. And so I think there is a lot of potential in those areas. In addition to, I'm sure there will be emergence of political parties in the coming months, as we hear about election or potential elections in the coming period.
Another question is, why was there not as much outrage in the US with the atrocities that were happening in Syria compared to what's happening with Palestine? And another is, what is the role of internationalists and leftists in the current period relating to Syria? And perhaps we'll end on those. Leila, do you want to take either of those?
So about the first question, why was there not the same outrage to atrocities in Syria as there was to Palestine? Well, I think it depends who you're looking at, because liberals tended to be very outraged by what was happening in Syria, but not what was happening in Palestine. And leftists tend to be very outraged what was happening in Palestine, but not what was happening in Syria. So, you know, there's no one who didn't know the extent of the regime's atrocities. Syrians have been reporting for years. We have so much testimony, photographic evidence of the horrors that went on inside prisons, the gas attacks. People turned a blind eye because they put their own ideological positions above the lives of reality of people on the ground. And many people on the left thought that Syrians could suffer the horrors of Sednaya as long as their anti-imperialist positions were being upheld from the comfort of the West. What was the second part of the question?
The role of internationalists and leftists. What should we do? I think you did mention a bit at the beginning in terms of allowing refugees to stay in countries if they so choose.
Calling for sanctions to be lifted, calling for foreign states to remove their militaries from Syria, and of course accountability. That's so important. Accountability for all people who have been involved in human rights violations and supporting that. And then, of course, you know, there's been a lot of questions, who are the progressives on the ground? I think it's going to be over the coming weeks that we'll really be able to get a picture of what's going on. You know, the regime's just fallen. People in Damascus, for example, haven't been able to organise since 2011. So many people are outside the country. But over the coming weeks, we will definitely see initiatives springing up. So it's up to us really to look for those and see where we can best support to ensure that those progressive voices have the strength to continue.
Yes, do you want to go first or?
Oh, go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, if I may, also on progressive forces, it's true, the despotic regime, etc. But we shouldn't forget the kind of secret networks that were also being, even in Damascus, we had, without forgetting that what prepared the ground for the kicking out of the regime in the south was, for example, the Sueda demonstration for the past year and a half, with very much inclusive democratic demands. And it really prepared the ground for when the military offensive was advancing, basically they were able to kick them out with also military support from local armed forces. But they've been, people organizing for the past year and a half, and to some extent even before in Sueda, with leftist heritage from different groups in this area. If we look at also at the same period, there was in the summer 2023, it was mostly a social media movement, but it expressed a frustration among sections of the youth in the coastal areas, but in Damascus it was the August 10th movement that was present in different areas of Syria with democratic, socio-economic frustrations. We're seeing, which is not fundamentally, I would say, it could be including democratic progressive framework, but we're seeing, civilian initiative throughout country. For example, I saw in Aleppo, to clean the streets. It could be considered not political, but bringing people together to take care of the services and, bringing people from all the different youth, religious sects, or etc. So these are things that are emerging. Against they are networks that were not necessarily known, that are trying to emerge, trying to organize. A couple of days ago, there was political civilian initiative in Tartus to discuss how to organize. Also, there was civilian youth, because maybe it's important to say to the auditors, but the coastal areas are not totally under the control of HTS. There's a bit of a fragmentation of power as well. And there's attempts by various democratic youth to prevent, sectarian tensions to emerge. And the issue also of justice transition will be very important, because until now, it's rather controlled. You have assassinations in terms of revenge of particular shabiha or of thugs, but it's not, you don't have outbursts of sectarian tensions, which is also a positive thing. So, and you have people trying to reorganize that. I might not completely agree, but you had, kind of Stalinist youth left. For example, the newspaper Qasyun, Iradat al-Shabi, they're distributing their own network, their own newspaper. They were kind of semi-opposition. So there's things that are dynamism. But what is really important is it's basically a sprint between the democratic progressive forces to organize and with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I think this is the main issue. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is accelerating the consolidation of power, whether with military opposition armed forces from Der'a, from other areas, SNA, and politically, meeting with all business networks. I was just saying Julani welcoming it, it's the palace, and preparing the road to it. It's really a sprint. Who will be ready to, if we're not able to basically build a counterpower from below, this will be the biggest threat. So it's emerging, it's difficult, but again, this space exists today. So yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you, Joseph. There is a real race between HTS and what the opposition could do in the coming weeks and months. But at the same time, I think what the Syrian Revolution did was really monumental. I mean, the revolutionary spirit in the end triumphed. What happened in the past several weeks, 2 weeks now, was the abolition of the prison system in Syria. I mean, this is not a small detail. This could be a lesson for the entire abolitionist movement worldwide. The question is how to protect that and to prevent HTS from reopening the prisons and reincarcerating the opposition and any people or any party that opposes them. On the question of cleaning the streets, I can't agree more with you, Joseph. I mean, there are doctors and engineers, all sorts of people cleaning the streets. I want to remind people that back in 1987, 89, the Israeli were terrified when they saw Palestinians cleaning the streets and making sure that their cities are clean and they're taking care of the space, because that sends a very powerful message that people are taking ownership of the neighborhood, of the space, and they are transforming them. The Tahrir Sham is trying to rebuild the state. They asked the police to come back and take back their work and different bureaucratic employees and what have you. So I think it's going to be an interesting several months. We're going to see what could happen. At the same time, a lot of Arab dictatorship have used the Syrian regime or the Syrian revolution as a way to send a strong message to their population that this could happen to them if they rebel against their authoritarian rule. And now that the regime is toppled, and now that all the statues have been dismantled and put down, a lot of Arab regimes are terrified of what could happen in Syria. So I think they're going to intervene in all sorts of ways. They're going to support all the reactionary forces. They're going to fund them, make sure that if there are elections, they're the ones who are going to win. And we have to be, aware of those forces and think about creative ways to push back and, resist them. But if we are able to do that, I think there is potential for igniting a second or third wave now of Arab revolts. The progressive forces in the Arab world, I think, are there, but they're latent. And there is a potential, a lot of potential for them to reemerge in every Arab country or beyond, for them to reemerge and resonate with what's happening in Syria. So I think there are a lot of moving parts. It's unclear where we're going to go. There are a lot of regional and international powers that will want to intervene to crush and prevent the emergence of real radical alternatives, because they do exist. From the Kurdish experience to what's happening in Sweden, to the whole history of local committee and revolutionary committees, and the multitude of villages and towns that were run for months and years by the local population, who learned how to take over that space and recreate the institution and reinvent life within very difficult conditions. So there is a lot of political culture that has radical potential. But I think there are also formidable adversary forces that will try to intervene and crush whatever potential there is in Syria. So I'm very hopeful, but I think we can't really tell how it's gonna evolve and where it's gonna go.
Thank you so much. Would any of you want to make Joseph or Leila, would you want to make a final comment before? I think the time is out, so I can't ask more questions, but okay. That was very comprehensive. I think that was a comprehensive look at the coming months too, Yasser. So thank you to each of you. Thank you to Haymarket Books and to all the endorsers. And as a reminder, subscribe to Spectre Journal for more of the politics of socialism from below and analyses of struggles against oppression. And we'll see you in the new year. Thank you.